Great to see so many people here, obviously, today. Um, Back to that conference theme, change making and making change. As Bronwyn's pointed out already, making change is what CRCs are all about. I don't know how many of you know this, but there are another 18 CRCs in operation out there at the moment, all trying to change in their own way, in their own sectors. Some of you, however, may not be aware that we actually have a predecessor in the shape of the Construction Innovation CRC. So I thought we might go back in history a little bit this morning, and as someone who's dabbled in history, you can believe me when I say that history can be very humbling. And if used correctly, history can also be incredibly instructive. The Construction Innovation CRC operated from 2001 to 2009 and was led by Keith Hampson out of QUT. I believe Robin Drogemuller was a program leader of that CRC. Robin, where are you? We had a little chat about that this morning over breakfast. Starting in around 2003, 2004, they did a look ahead to see what the industry would be like way off in the future, far too distant for anyone to imagine, in 2020. Construction Innovation CRC surveyed their networks and identified the big problems of the day, and then they came up with some visions for how they thought they might tackle these problems in future, and they called this Construction 2020. So what visions did the team come up with back then? I'll just quickly race through those. So vision number 1 was around sustainability. Vision number 2 was around client and stakeholder needs. Vision 3 was around the operating model improvement. Vision 4 was workforce welfare and education. Vision 5 was around IT, which I take to mean BIM back in those days, and the implementation of BIM. Vision number 6 was around visualization and prototyping technologies. Vision 7 was around off-site construction. And Vision 8 was around management processes and supply chain improvement. So how do we think our colleagues at the Innovation CRC went? I think I'd have to say that in terms of their identification of the big issues, I think they did pretty well. I think it holds up pretty well. But how do we think we've gone as an industry in achieving these visions? Do we think we've made any ground at all? And I'd have to say probably not much. So after the Construction Innovation CRC ended in 2009, it became an independent research centre called the Sustainable Built Environment National Research Centre, and that's based in Western Australia at Curtin University, and that continues today. And I think that's a very honourable legacy indeed for that group. And I guess I get to that humbling part of history now. So let's compare Construction 2020 briefly with our list of issues that we identified way back in 2019 when we all sat down to work out what we should tackle in our CRC. I'll just quickly race through them. Obviously, we spoke about new business models, stakeholder engagement, development and finance models, improved supply and value chains, advanced building design, digitisation and digitalisation, optimised production, improved and safer assembly, new materials and systems, sustainability and performance, better governance, and of course, that much needed cultural change. So clearly there's a lot of overlap here, but what does this overlap actually show us? On the one hand, you might say it reinforces that in building there's nothing new under the sun. But on the other hand, and I favour this version, I think we just have to say that we've still got actually the same problems. So we weren't aware of Construction 2020 when we put this list of issues together. Going back to the Construction 2020 issues and visions, clearly these were issues at the time and they were on the horizon, but I don't think looking back that we would say many of these things were existential threats. But the same cannot be said of today's circumstances. And as I said before, I think we need to face facts and say that the situation hasn't improved in building. In fact, it's probably gotten worse. I don't think that the building industry has fully absorbed the lessons of digitalisation and industrialisation from other sectors in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, and we'll talk about this in great depth in the final session of today. Its culture and business environment has not improved. And creating a more sustainable building industry is no longer a nice to have. It's absolutely essential today. So one of my takeaways from this document is that the building industry has been occupied with incremental innovation for decades. But I feel, and I think everyone in the CRC feels, that we need something more urgent, more transformative if we're able to tackle the big problems of our time. So how indeed do we get there? Another way to look for lessons in Construction 2020, I think, is to think less about in terms of what is on the page of visions and perhaps more about what's missing. The author, Elizabeth Gilbert, said that great art is both surprising and inevitable, and I think that that holds for great ideas and innovations as well. What's emerged in the last 17 years that we would consider to be both surprising and inevitable? I think definitely we could count the rise of the internet as part of that. But I would also point to the emergence of the tech giants, the tech industry, their use of platforms, platform business models, and their supporting infrastructure. There was no iPhone in 2005, and therefore there was no app store. Netflix was mailing DVDs to its customers, and Amazon was still mainly for buying books. Uber and Airbnb were not yet twinkles in anyone's eyes. In terms of social media, Facebook had just emerged, and MySpace was where all the action was at, not a cliff in sight for that poor company. But in roughly 5 years, all of this would change forever. So what powered this transformation? What accelerated these companies and their growth into the stratosphere? I'm sure most of you have heard of the concept of network effects, but who really understands it? I thought I did. I thought it meant that scale begets scale, and that's partly true, but it's only part of the equation. I learned a better definition from this book, which says that network effects are when the value of a product or service increases when more people use it. You only have to think of Google Maps, for example. When the more people use it, the better the representation of the traffic conditions are. So these platforms exist to connect producers and consumers in new and more valuable ways. And they've transformed almost everything, and they are powered by this network effect. The emergence of these platforms is, in the truest sense, both surprising and inevitable, and they are missing from Construction 2020. At the CRC, we think their explosive, transformative effects could have a huge impact on the building industry. And this is why we've been advocating for quite some time for their adoption. Indeed, anyone who's here today who joined the CRC would have seen these slides in the lead-up. So let's ask a really difficult question. What do we think we will be doing in 17 years from now, in 2039? Comparing ourselves to Construction Innovation CRC, how will our vision hold up? What will our legacy be? What will emerge in the next 17 years that will both surprise us and at the same time seem completely inevitable? I suggest we ask ourselves these questions today. Let's ask how, in the spirit of collaboration, we can work together to make the change that this industry so desperately needs, and which, as Bronwyn has pointed out, is the reason we are all here. Obviously, at the beginning of the day, and as Daryl just said, you've heard me talking about new opportunities and business models and value chain restructuring. And it was interesting, we really didn't prep each panel, but every panel, I think, has in some ways returned to this key issue. We've obviously been talking about this kind of holistic change for quite a while, and I think today has provided additional evidence, if that were necessary, that is gaining traction elsewhere. I do want to pull up one example that I became aware of in the last 2 weeks, just because I thought it was interesting and underlined this kind of sub-theme of the conference. And it's the recent re-emergence of that enfant terrible, the Adam Neumann, and the rebrand of his We Live company as, and I want to hear a drum roll, no longer called We Live because that sounds too much like We Work, it's called Flow. So it's not surprising that Neumann would have a crack again at the residential market, despite the spectacular crash of WeWork. But 2 weeks ago, there was some surprising news. One of Silicon Valley's most respected VCs, Andreessen Horowitz, had invested a spectacular sum in Flow. Let's hear from Mark Andreessen. You're not supposed to read that. Mark Andreessen on the reasons why his VC invested the paltry sum of $350 million in an idea about the future of building. I say an idea because this business does not earn money yet. And I quote, "Only through a seismic shift in the way industry relationships are structured and the mechanisms through which value is delivered can we hope to address the underlying problems of the current system and build the solution. This means rethinking the entire value chain from the way buildings are purchased and owned to the way residents interact with their buildings to the way value is distributed among stakeholders. And given the fragmented nature of the ecosystem today, we can only hope to accomplish any of this by bringing every aspect of the living experience together." I think that's a really astute piece of analysis there from someone that, as far as I'm aware of, has no real background in the building industry, but to identify that so succinctly and to be so committed to make their largest ever first round investment ever, I think really says something about the size of the pie of the innovation market in building. So in this regard, and picking up on some of the theme of today, we've got our own announcement to make, and no, it's not a $350 million investment, sadly. With co-funding from the Advanced Manufacturing Growth Centre and partnering with Prefab Oz and the CRC, and I'd welcome Damien Cray here, Chairman of Prefab Oz. The CRC would like to announce our upcoming initiative, which is business model innovation in the building industry, better buildings and better bottom lines, a topic that we've spoken a lot about in this last session today. This initiative will engage with the Australian industry around opportunities and barriers of business model innovation. Over the next year, we'll be travelling around the country to talk with industry, and we need your help and input to do this. We've outlined 4 workshops that will take place in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne and Adelaide, and culminate in a roadmap, or maybe we should call them recipes, Yaka, to address business model innovation along with many of the other initiatives that we've been discussing today. For example, how could a new value chain improve sustainability outcomes? How could it help economic development, both domestically and internationally? And how can companies avail themselves of the benefits of digitalisation and industrialisation that we've heard about just now in this session? One more final thing before I go. I want to put out a special thanks to our research partners, to Monash University, who've generously hosted us here today and who are a founding partner of the CRC, helping to bring myself and my team to this fine city, the University of Melbourne, and our partners at QT. I also can't end today without giving a huge thanks to the CRC executive, all of whom have done an especially fine job here today, the members of the CRC board and particularly Bronwyn for chairing a session and being around all day long. Again, thank you so much for a wonderful, great day. Please stay safe. I'll leave it at that. Thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure.